right here is where the great American experiment comes alive. Join us in the fight to restore liberty and American exceptionalism. And together, let's make the case that our charters of freedom are worth defending and honoring. Let's get to work. Hello, I'm Shane Krauser, and I want to welcome you back to Freedom Fires. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about the purpose of the Constitution. Last time we met, we talked about the purpose of government. We now know that the purpose of government is to secure the rights of the people. All power to govern begins with we the people. We've established a government whose primary motivation and function must be to secure the rights of the very people that they govern. So we learned that. Today we're going to be talking about the purpose of the Constitution. What is it supposed to do? What is its design, and how does it carry out the words outlined specifically in the document? And you know, there are a lot of misunderstandings about what is in the Constitution and what it's designed to do. For example, we hear a lot of folks talk about the pursuit of happiness, that's somehow codified in the Constitution itself. Of course, those words come directly from the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Those were the words of Thomas Jefferson as he outlined the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution did something a little bit different. It changed the words just slightly: life, liberty, property. But nevertheless, a misunderstanding that we commonly have about the Constitution. It's important to be able to speak precisely about what is in both of these documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. In addition, there's a misconception about where our rights come from. If you talk to mainstream Americans, you'll get a number of different answers, including our rights come from government, which is wrong. Our rights come from the Constitution. That's wrong as well. The Constitution doesn't give us anything. It doesn't give us our liberties. It simply is a document that outlines some of our liberties in order to put government on notice as to what rights it must protect. And so that's another misconception that we all often deal with. We also talk a lot about democracy in this country. You have a lot of the talking heads, even those in government, talking about how this country is a democracy. The Constitution says something quite different. It outlines that it is establishing a constitutional republic. And as we're going to learn today, a democracy and a republic are different things, and they have drastically different consequences. So it's important to understand the philosophy of democracy versus the philosophy of a constitutional republic. So not only do you have a lot of misunderstanding as to what the Constitution is designed to do and what's contained in the document, you also have a basic lack of knowledge. For example, the First Amendment. There are 5 liberties outlined in the First Amendment, but you know that very few Americans can outline even 3 of the 5 liberties. In fact, more Americans can outline the 5 members of the Simpson family before they could name the 5 liberties outlined in the First Amendment. More than that, you have very few individuals that could name even 3. More people can name the 3 judges on American Idol than could name 3 of the 5 liberties outlined in the First Amendment. So as we work together, you're going to get to understand and know those things very well. The First Amendment, the 5 liberties: speech, assembly, religion, freedom of the press, and then petitioning the government for redress of grievances. We're going to learn those things together very well. So let's move on and let's talk a little bit about the purpose of the Constitution. In a nutshell, the purpose of the Constitution is this: it is designed to be a complex maze of booby traps that is to stop tyrannical impulses in their tracks. Think about that. The Constitution is a complex maze of booby traps designed to stop tyrannical impulses in their tracks. We're supposed to have a Constitution that outlines specific grants of authority that government is permitted to exercise. In other words, it limits what government can do. And unless it tells government that they can do it, they can't do it. It's off limits. So the Constitution is a limiting document. We're concerned about tyrannical impulses. We're concerned about what men might do with power. And so we put together a Constitution that stops tyranny, or at least it's supposed to stop tyranny. The only way that it does that is if you have a people that are knowledgeable and that are engaged and that understand what the document is designed to do and can apply it effectively within the culture, both political and social. What makes our Constitution different? Well, a number of things. Think about how many constitutions have existed throughout the world and have failed in turn. Brazil has had 5 constitutions, or excuse me, Brazil has had 8 constitutions since 1822. Russia has had 4 constitutions since 1918. Poland has had 7 constitutions since 1921. Afghanistan has had 5 in the 20th century alone, and France has had 15 since R1. Our Constitution is different. It has survived the test of time, and one of the primary reasons why it has survived as compared to so many other constitutions is because it begins with some fundamental premises that are undeniable. One of those is that our freedoms are inherent. Government doesn't give us those liberties. The Constitution doesn't give us our liberties. Other people don't give us our liberties. They exist by virtue of our humanity, and the Declaration of Independence outlines that. That is the fundamental premise of our Constitution. You cannot read the Constitution without understanding the Declaration, and vice versa. So we have a Constitution that it has indeed survived the test of time, and as we move forward together, it's going to become abundantly clear as to why our Constitution is different. So let's go to our preamble. There's no better place to look than our preamble when trying to understand what the purpose of the Constitution is. A more perfect union. Starts with we the people in order to form a more perfect union. What does that mean? It means we have a common purpose, a common motivation, and what would that common purpose and motivation be? Freedom. That's what we're trying to move forward towards. That's the ideal that we're striving to obtain. We want individuals to be able to exercise their free will, to make their choices free from government interference, and so long as I'm not hurting my next door neighbor or anybody else for that matter, I should be free to do those things. That's what this Constitution was put in place and what it's designed to do, to facilitate that common purpose and motivation. Next, establish justice. What does that mean to put together a Constitution in order to establish justice? Well, we're talking about the principles of due process, of equal protection, of fairness. That is, when government goes about dealing with the people, that it does so in a way that is fair. And we have some principles outlined in the Declaration of Independence that make it rather clear what it is that government can do as it interacts with the very people that it governs. Domestic tranquility. What does that mean? Well, to ensure peace within American borders. It's a primary function of government. We see that going on at the state and local level, but more importantly, as we're talking about a U.S. Constitution, the federal government has that obligation as well, to ensure that there is peace within our borders. Next, common defense. What does that mean? Well, simply this: to protect against enemies, both foreign and domestic. In order to remain free, and in order to uphold this Constitution, you have to have a system in place that ensures that individuals that stand in opposition to freedom, that stand in opposition to the rule of law, are defended against, that they are warded off, and we are protecting the people and their fundamental right to go out and do those things that they wish to do. General welfare, to promote the general welfare. What does that mean? Well, it means to meet the general needs of society, to encourage innovation, creativity, prosperity, to allow the individual to exercise free will. And finally, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our prosperity. That means that this Constitution is not just designed for the individuals that wrote it or for individuals that are enjoying the blessings of that document today, but for everyone that lives in this country, to allow generations to come to enjoy the liberties that are protected through this Constitution. So our preamble does a very good job of outlining what the purpose of our Constitution is, and then we have 7 articles that follow in this document that outline how the various branches of government will interact and how they will deal with the people just the same. So let's move into some critical principles, some critical components of the Constitution. Now, this is important, and the reason why this is important is because in our society, we often talk about bad government. It's easy to sit back and talk about how bad things are. Well, unless you know what the solutions look like, it's not going to do us a whole lot of good to talk about how bad things are. We got to know what good government looks like. We have to know, if we are to eliminate all of those bad things going on in our country today, what it is that we should be replacing it with. So let's talk about what good government looks like in light of our Constitution. First of all, when we talk about our Constitution, we start with the underlying premise of inherent liberties. Again, our liberties don't come from other individuals. Our liberties don't come from government. Our liberties don't come from a piece of parchment paper. Our liberties are inherent. They exist by virtue of our humanity. And to show you a little bit about the diversity of this view and some of the contention that exists in this country with respect to where our liberties come from, let's take a look at Senator Tom Harkin, senator out of Iowa, as he talks about health care and health care's relationship to unalienable rights. Let's take a look.
What this bill does is we finally take that step. As our leader said earlier, we take that step from health care as a privilege to health care as an inalienable right of every single American citizen. And as I've said before, this bill is not complete. I've used the analogy of a starter home, in which we can add additions and enhancements as we go into the future. But like every right that we've ever passed for the American people, we revisit it later on to enhance and build on those rights.
So Senator Tom Harkin makes a profound statement. And his statement is simply this: we have finally given the American people the unalienable right to health care. That's an individual who does not understand not only the purpose of the Constitution, but the underlying premise of the Constitution, which is our liberties are inherent. Government can't give the people anything. Government can't give the people an unalienable right. An unalienable right just exists. It exists by virtue of our humanity. So when we're talking about unalienable rights in the context of inherent liberties, here's what's important to understand. An unalienable right, again, is it inherent in us? But more than that, when you are exercising an unalienable right, it is something that does not require the assistance of a third party to exercise. And that's precisely the problem with Senator Tom Harkin. He's saying that we're going to provide you something, namely health care, but it's going to be provided at the expense of somebody else. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of an unalienable right. That is more in the context of a privilege. And we'll debate whether or not that's a legitimate privilege or not, but it's certainly, we know without hesitation that it is certainly not a right. I brought here today a picture of metal, looks like a fence. Well, this is actually a piece of the Berlin Wall. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came tumbling down, and in 1990, they announced the reunification effort between East Germany and West Germany. And I happened to be just about 30 miles south of the border when this happened. And I remember being there and as a young boy and thinking back to my homeland, namely America. And it clicked for me in some very important ways what was going on and why America was unique. The thought that came to mind as I held this in my hand, right there on the border, was simply this. If what you had was so great, why did you have to lock your people up? Why did you have to put them in a cage? In other words, they weren't allowing their people to make fundamental choices for themselves. America, we don't have a cage. We allow individuals, at least ideally, to behave in a way that we would consider free. And so when I think about the Berlin Wall, I think about really the exceptionalism of America, why we're unique, and going back to that first critical principle of the Constitution, that of inherent liberties. So when we're talking about good government and what that looks like, we have to recall that any good government, if it's going to be sustainable, has to begin with the proposition of inherent liberties. Next, power in the people. Good government begins with the people calling the shots, the people making the decisions. Remember back in the Declaration of Independence that we talked about a little bit earlier? We learned that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are the fundamental liberties that we talked about, which is point number one. But point number two is, where does government get their power to act to begin with? Well, it tells us in that following sentence in the Declaration of Independence, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. We allow people to make choices. It's not something like the philosopher kings. You know, if you've read Plato's Republic, or you've read Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, those books, those pieces of literature, begin with the proposition that men and women cannot govern themselves, that we are inclined towards violence. We're inclined towards violating the rights of other individuals. We're inclined towards greed. Therefore, the philosopher kings must rise up, and those few philosopher kings will decide the rules of the game. In other words, the people don't get to decide. The few that ultimately rise up with enough power will dictate how the peasants behave. What is odd about that is this. If the people, that is mainstream, is inclined towards greed and power and violence, how is it that the philosopher kings are not inclined towards those things? It's a fundamental contradiction. It's a fundamental fallacy. It makes no sense. Our Constitution begins with a different proposition, and that is, it doesn't start from the leaders on down. It starts from the people down to the leaders, us giving them power to govern. And so any good government is going to begin with power in the people. And in fact, our Constitution and its preamble starts with precisely that point. We, the people of the United States. Next, any good government has to have a constitution. You simply can't rely on leaders to be benevolent. You can't rely on leaders to do what it is that they might promise that they might do. You have to have a document in place, and our founders recognized this early on. The founders recognized that you had to have a document that specifically outlined what government was permitted to do and what they were not permitted to do, and then you had to include within that document an oath that those individuals that would govern would ultimately take. Now, there's two very, very important principles found in our Constitution that I think are critical. Number one, division of power and separation of authority. That is, you don't give all power to govern to one branch or one individual. Why? Well, let me take you back to a high school. I was in a high school, and we spend a lot of time in the high schools as we travel the country. And this is a common principle that we teach our young people. And they get it. Most human beings understand this just intuitively. And I generally will do this. I'll bring a student up, generally a member of the student council, and I'll have them come up next to me. And I'll tell the students that I'm going to grant or vest authority into this student to do certain things. In other words, they get to make certain decisions for the students. They're going to decide when you come to school, when you leave school. They get to decide what classes you're going to take. They get to decide who your teachers will be. They get to decide how long your bathroom breaks will be. They get to decide what the subject matter will be that you are going to be participating in and day out. They get to decide when you go to lunch, how long your lunch break will be, what you're going to eat for lunch. They get to make all of those decisions for you. And then I ask the students, does anybody have a problem with me granting this authority to this particular student? And you'll very rarely get students that will raise their hand and say that they're okay. Sometimes you do. Sometimes you'll have a student, they'll raise their hand and say, I'm just fine, and then I'll ask them, why are you fine with them having that much authority? And the student will say, well, because I trust them. That's fine. But then I'll ask the others, the majority, the overwhelming majority, why is it that you have a problem with this person having that much authority? And here's what they'll say. We're concerned that she or he will go on a power trip. They go on a power trip. That's exactly what our founding fathers were concerned about. Individuals being given power and going on a power trip. And so we don't give that one student all that power, just like we don't give the president all of the power, or the legislature all of the power, or the courts all of the power. We take various government responsibilities and we divide them up among the three branches of government. Why? Because we're trying to avoid tyranny. We're trying to avoid any particular branch of government engaging or participating in these tyrannical impulses that we see happen time and time again throughout various societies, not just today, but throughout history. We don't want individuals going on a power trip. So division of power and separation of authority are important, and our Constitution does just that. I've got here a beaver trap or a coyote trap. I think that this illustrates rather persuasively what the purpose of the Constitution is in light of division of power and division of authority. Very few people would put their hands in this. Why? Because it would hurt. Right? It's common sense. So if we were to take this, somebody were to put their hand or their fingers or their foot in this, it would be painful. There's a reason why it's used to catch animals. It's very, very effective. It's powerful. It stops whatever it is that's moving in its path, in its tracks. The Constitution is designed to do just that. The Constitution is a complex maze of booby traps designed to stop tyranny in its tracks. Well, that begs the question then. If the Constitution is a complex maze of booby traps designed to stop tyranny in its tracks, why do we have tyranny today in America? Why does it exist? I can hear the question, Mr. Krauser, if what you're saying is true, that the Constitution is designed to stop tyranny, why does tyranny exist? It's very simple. We, the people, ultimately will decide whether or not the Constitution has teeth. The power begins with us. And so what we have today in America is a very interesting dynamic. You have individuals in government at all levels that are doing things in direct defiance of the Constitution. Why? Because we, the people, have allowed that to happen. You have individuals at all levels of government who don't understand the principles of the Constitution and what it means to be free. Why? Because we, the people, don't understand those things either. So when you have a population or a citizenry that doesn't understand what it means to be free or the purpose of the Constitution, it just stands to reason that we in turn will vote in individuals that don't understand the purpose of the Constitution and don't understand what it means to be free. The only way this Constitution survives, the only way the Constitution has teeth, is if we stand on the forefront and enforce this document. We, the people, are ultimately the enforcers of this document. So that's number one, division of power, separation of authority. We don't want individuals to go on a power trip. We, the people, are the enforcers of the Constitution. Now, just as important when we're talking about critical components of the Constitution, or any Constitution for that matter, that we want to see survive the test of time and advance the principles of freedom, we've got to have a Constitution that enumerates rights. Now, this is important. I want to take you back for just a moment to September 17th, 1787. Remember, this is the day where the Constitution is voted on by all of the various delegates that were at that convention. And there are a few individuals that refused to put their hand to this document. George Mason was one of them. Governor Edmund Randolph of Virginia was another individual who refused to put his hand to the Constitution. And of course, James Madison and George Washington were very concerned. They just spent 4 months together putting together this document, and now they go for the final vote, and George Mason and Edmund Randolph, at least two of the individuals that were there, are concerned. They said, we're not going to put our hand to this Constitution unless it has an enumeration of rights, that is a Bill of Rights. And we know that those individuals did not sign. And there was a period of time, about 3 years, almost 3 years before a Bill of Rights was ultimately ratified. So when we're looking at our original Constitution that's adopted in 1787, ratified in 1788, it did not have a Bill of Rights. And as this Constitution is debated in the various states, that's a big concern. So the appropriate action is taken to begin reviewing the Bill of Rights. That is, what should be included in a Bill of Rights that will accompany this Constitution. So that's put in place. And we know today that the Bill of Rights was adopted and ratified in 1791, and for good reason. Governor Edmund Randolph and George Mason, they were absolutely right. To have a Constitution that survives the test of time, you've got to have an enumeration of rights. Why? Well, this is another misunderstanding as to where our rights come from. If you were to ask mainstream America, what is the purpose of the Bill of Rights? They would tell you, well, the Bill of Rights gives us our freedom. That's wrong. That's not true. The reason why you have a Bill of Rights is to remind government as to what our liberties are, and to make sure as they go about doing the things that they're permitted to do in that Constitution, that they don't tread on the fundamental liberties of the people. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, abridging the free exercise of religion, violating the freedom of the people to assemble. They shall not make a law that violates the right of the people to keep and bear arms. So we have all of these things in the First and Second Amendment, for example, that doesn't give us our liberties. No, it puts government on notice as to what they are not permitted to do. As you go about doing those things outlined in the Constitution, don't touch these things. Don't touch speech. Don't touch religion. Don't touch the fundamental right to bear arms. Don't touch privacy. These are all things that are put in place. So when we're talking about the critical principles of the Constitution, enumeration of rights is absolutely imperative. And, we can look back now to 1791 and we can compare it to today. I think we understand why the small government people back at the convention knew what they were talking about. If we didn't have those things outlined, we might be experiencing a lot more problems and much more difficulty today. Numeration of rights. Finally, the fifth component of good government, the fifth component that must be embraced by a constitution that's going to survive the test of time, is a republican form of government. Let me walk you through this because this is important to understand. I once had a student in one of my classes came through, and I'll always ask my students, do we live in a democracy? And the overwhelming majority say, of course we live in a democracy. Well, they have some pretty warped ideas about the way the world operates, let alone what government is designed to do and the philosophy that surrounds the government that we've established through our Constitution. So we talk about democracy, but then we also talk about the other alternatives. Constitutional republic is one of those alternatives. But we don't hear those things. What we hear is we want to spread democracy, democracy, democracy. No, we don't want to spread democracy throughout the world. We want to spread freedom throughout the world. So if we want to spread freedom throughout the world, it begs the question, what form of government would best facilitate freedom? Well, it's not democracy. Our founding fathers told us that democracy is one of the most vile forms of government known to man. Thomas Jefferson said, it's tyranny of the majority. That is, you'll have the opportunity to enjoy freedom so long as you find yourself in the majority. But the minute you fall within the minority in a democracy, best of luck. Do you feel lucky is really what it comes down to. So a constitutional republic is something different. So let's walk through a couple of illustrations to really show you what a democracy is, what a constitutional republic is, and why a constitutional republic is superior. And I want to take you to the Wild West. And I want you to imagine that somebody steals my horse. And as I live out on my ranch, I'm associated with a number of townspeople in this small area in which I live. And I tell the townspeople to go after this horse thief. And sure enough, because he stole my slowest horse, we have no problem catching him. And he's brought into the town, and I make my case to the townspeople. What do we do? What do we do to horse thieves? Well, we hang them. We hang horse thieves. And if you don't hang this horse thief, you're going to be sending the wrong message to other individuals who might consider stealing your horse. That is, he's coming after you next. He's coming after your chickens. He's coming after your sheep. He's coming after your property. He's coming into your home. We've got to send a powerful message. And that powerful message is, don't tread on the property of other people. And then I request your vote. As a member of the town, I request your vote. All those in favor of hanging this horse thief, go ahead and raise your hand. And of course, you all raise your hand, and there you have it. We hang him. What just happened there? What just happened? That's a democracy in action. I requested the vote of the townspeople. The majority say yes, and he experiences the consequences. That's a democracy in action. When people get to come to the ballot box, or people get to simply arrive and say, this is what we think should happen to this one individual or this particular freedom, that's a democracy, and that's not what our Constitution is designed to do. So compare that democracy to this scenario. Very similar scenario. Person steals the horse. We round him up. We bring him back. And when we bring him back, I make my spiel again. And I say, all those in favor of hanging this man, raise your hand. And of course, everybody raised their hand. But what happens in a constitutional republic as opposed to a democracy? The sheriff shows up. The sheriff is a member of the executive branch. What is his job? His job is to enforce the law. His job is to make sure that even if he may not like the individual, that's not what it's about. His job is to ensure that fairness exists before the individual is punished, that due process is served. So the sheriff shows up and says, you can't hang this man. He has rights. Well, what are those rights? He has a right to a fair trial. He has a right to a public trial. He has a right to a speedy trial. He has a right to confront those witnesses being brought against him by the alleged victim as well as the government that may have talked to witnesses and says, this is a witness we want to bring in to prove that in fact a crime was committed. He has a right to bring in his own witnesses to testify on his own behalf. That is, the alleged horse thief might have a defense. What might his defense be? Well, he had consent, or there's some sort of necessity, or he believed it was his horse. Whatever the case may be, he has a fundamental right to come in and present his defense. He also has a right to have counsel assist him through the process. That's exactly what's going on here. He can have counsel assist him. He has a right to remain silent and that silence not be used against him. And perhaps most importantly, in this case, he has a right to a fair and impartial jury. And what does that mean? All of those buckaroos that voted to hang him earlier in that democratic form of government, they're not sitting on this jury. They are not fair and impartial. We're going to get individuals that know nothing about the case, that do not have a vested interest, to sit on that jury and listen to the government present their case, and ultimately it's the government that has to meet their burden. That's the difference between a democracy versus a republic. Democracy is all about majority rule. A constitutional republic is about the rule of law. Indifference towards any particular group or idea or what it is that an individual may want to do as he moves on with his life. The idea is we protect even the minority, and that's the difference between a democracy and a constitutional republic. So let's summarize what we've talked about here today. The summary of our Constitution, number one, the Constitution is a complex maze of booby traps designed to stop tyranny in its tracks. And our Constitution begins with two immovable piers. And those immovable piers are this: men and women are born free, and men and women with power cannot be trusted. Think about that in the context of our Constitution. Our Declaration starts with that underlying premise that men and women are born free. The Constitution is the codification of that idea. Just the same, the Declaration of Independence talks about how men and women with power cannot be trusted. We're concerned about King George, and we're concerned that that may happen in the future. So what do we do in our Constitution? We ensure that individuals who do have power are limited as to what they can do. And why? Because we don't trust individuals with power. We're concerned about that power trip. And so as we think about this, I want you to think in the context of the culture war that we're dealing with today. Because those of us that believe in small government, more freedom, we believe in these underlying principles of men and women are born free, and men and women with power cannot be trusted. Those people that don't agree with us believe in something a little bit different. They believe that men and women are not necessarily born free, and that men and women with power can be trusted. See, they've turned the philosophy on its head. We've got to be prepared to argue against those ideas. Because if you buy into the idea that men and women are not born free, what's the logical extension of that? Very simple. Only government can liberate the individual. So look at some of the policies taking place in our country today where government stands up, like the Senator Tom Harkin, and he says, we've finally given the people the unalienable right to health care. Why is he able to say something like that? Because he believes that it's only government that can liberate the individual. In addition, men and women with power can be trusted. What's the extension of that? You don't need a constitution. You don't need necessarily the rule of law if men and women with power can be trusted. We don't believe in those ideas. The Constitution doesn't subscribe to those ideas either. Men and women are born free. Men and women with power cannot be trusted. That's where we begin. And so that's where we're at today. I want you to take that. I want you to absorb it, embrace it, and you're going to continue to learn the freedom narrative along with me. And when we come back, we're going to talk about rights versus privileges, and we're going to have a great time doing it. So until next time, I'm Shane Krauser with Freedom Fires.